Republican Senator Gregg is on the Senate Banking Committee, and he's been involved in some intense bipartisan negotiations on this issue for months. So, Senator Gregg, I know there's some unhappiness with a lot of Republicans that somehow Democrats are pushing this bill onto the floor so quickly. But what's wrong with getting the bill on the floor and starting the debate from there? Because this vote this week is simply about bringing the bill to the floor. It's not about the bill itself, correct?
Yes, but procedurally, once the bill gets on the floor in the form that they want to bring it on the floor, which is a totally partisan bill, it would take 60 votes to amend it. So the chances of actually doing something once it gets on the floor are very, very limited. And the problem, of course, is that we don't need to do this in this way. There is a process going forward right now where there's substantive activity, and we're pretty close to agreement on the major components of a very good regulatory reform bill. And certainly everybody in my caucus wants a good bill. We want to address too big to fail. We want to address derivatives. We want to address consumer protection. We want to reorder the regulatory structure so we get a more effective regulatory structure and there's no shopping around for weak regulators. All of that, there's basically agreement on in substance in 90% of those areas. And so
Senator
I think
Gregg,
we could reach
what's the sticking point for you? What's your sticking point?
Well, I don't have... Honestly, I don't have a whole lot of sticking points if we went to the language which we've worked out. If you went to the Corker-Warner language for resolution, if you went to the language which Senator Reid, Jack Reid and I have pretty much worked out on derivatives, if you went to the Shelby-Dodd language on consumer protection, and you went to the general agreement we had on how we're going to structure the regulatory agencies, I got some concerns about that because I think the Fed is dealt a poor hand there. But I don't have any big problems. The problem is the bill that will hit the floor has none of that in it and is really a disastrous bill, in my opinion, and to amend it, it would take 60 votes, as I said.
Well, I guess the other thing that's going on is this issue over the quote-unquote, the Mitch McConnell hitting on the perpetual bailouts, this bailout mechanism. But isn't this in some ways attacking a Republican measure? I mean, this was a Bob Corker negotiated idea, which was to have the industry pay for its own future bailout if it was ever necessary.
Yes, well, actually, that was part of the agreement that Senator Corker and Senator Warner worked out, but a lot of the other parts of that agreement were not included in the Dodd bill, and so the Dodd bill has a very weak and very, I think, not really effective proposal for ending too big to fail, and we want to end too big to fail, because if you've got a situation out there where people think that the taxpayers are going to come in and support a business which has basically overasserted its position and gotten into heavy risk situations, if the market feels that way, then you're going to have an inefficient use of capital. You don't want to have the capital markets and the markets generally presume that the taxpayers are going to back up any company. Companies should fail if they've gotten out of whack with their risk situations.
Explain this, because that $50 billion fund, which the White House, by the way, seems pretty cool to, seems like they're ready to jettison that at a moment's notice. But, but aside from that, I mean, that fund is paid for by the financial institutions themselves, correct? Right.
Yes, but the problem is when you put $50 billion on the table, anywhere in Washington, it gets spent for something else. Let me tell you, the Congress will spend every cent it can find, and when it sees a pool of money of $50 billion, which is a pretty big pool of money, it's going to spend it on something else. So I don't want to see that money just sitting around being available for Congress to put into some other social services program or some initiative that a bunch of congressmen think makes sense and has motherhood on it, and it ends up getting spent. So that's the problem I have with having a pre-funded event here. I think it makes much more sense to have the funding come in on the back end and make sure that it's the businesses which benefit from the stability of the situation that pay for the fund.
Real quickly, I'm sure you've heard that Democrats are doing some campaigning on this SEC fraud suit against Goldman Sachs. Do you approve of that?
No, no. I mean, we should not legislate based on anecdotal events. This is a big issue, this piece of legislation. We shouldn't overreact. We might overreact as a Congress, and if we do overreact, we're going to undermine the ability of people on Main Street to get credit and our capital markets to give people who are entrepreneurs the resources they need to go out and create jobs. And Congress tends to overreact when it acts on anecdotal information. And this is a single event. We don't even know what the outcome of the event will be. Obviously, Goldman thinks it did nothing wrong and has been very aggressive in saying that. So I don't think that Congress should be pursuing major regulatory overhaul based on this one instance, and I think it's really disingenuous for some people to try to pursue regulatory reform based off of this one instance.
Senator, very quickly, is your hope that Harry Reid and Chris Dodd do not bring this legislation to the floor this week and instead try to maybe delay for a few days or a week some sort of and get the negotiated bill on the floor?
I understand that Richard Shelby, who's the ranking Republican, and Chris Dodd, the chairman of the committee, are negotiating negotiating in good faith and aggressively right now. I think we ought to give those two guys another week, 2 weeks to try to work out the details of a compromise bill that will be comprehensive, and I think we'll get a much better piece of legislation.
All right, Senator Judd Gregg, in the middle of all of these negotiations joining us, thanks very much.
Thank you.